Hello everyone! Today we'll be talking about late medieval and early Renaissance Northern Europe. So in the following chapters we're going to be discussing art of Italy, but today we're going to be up here, and as you'll notice on this map, Europe as we know it was slightly different during this time period. Germany didn't exist, instead it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and much of the work that we're going to be looking at today comes from an area that's referred to as Flanders, which in present-day Europe is broken down into numerous other countries. First, in order to discuss the artwork of this time period, we have to talk a little bit about the Bubonic Plague. The Bubonic Plague is a disease, also known as the Black Death, and it's transmitted through fleas that have bitten rats that are infected with this disease and then later pass them on to humans. Nowadays there is a cure, but during the 1400s there was no known cure, and there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that killed at least 75 million people in Europe during the 1400s. That would have been about 25% of the population, which is enormous. I think it's difficult for us today to imagine the impact because we have medicine and hospitals, but imagine a time period where there was nothing that you could do. You would just have to stand back and watch your family members die. People were dying so rapidly that the bodies were just thrown into the streets. There was no time to bury them even, and of course this just facilitated the transmission of the disease. It was called the Black Death because this disease also caused the limbs to rot, so here's a picture of it, and bubonic plague because the disease causes buboes, which are swollen glands that look like this. As you can imagine, of course, this incident affected the art of the time period immensely. Here's a little woodcut that depicts the dance of death. We also have some writings that have existed from the Black Death. This is a dramatic excerpt that I'll just read you briefly, and it's from the journal of Agnolo di Turro del Grasso, which means the fat in Italian, and here's what he had to say. People began to die in Siena in May 1348. It was a cruel and horrible thing. I do not know where to begin to tell of the cruelty and horror of it. Survivors were so distraught they were almost without feeling. Victims died almost at once. People would swell up in their armpits and their groins. Fathers abandoned children, wives, husbands, brothers, and sisters. No one could be found to bury the dead. Mass graves were dug in Siena and were piled deep with the dead. They died by the hundreds day and night. I, Agnolo di Turro, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. I just include that so that you can try and imagine how this would have affected people of the 1400s. So we're going to look at some artwork where you can see some of the lasting effects of this event. We're going to look at some examples from illustrated manuscripts, and an illuminated manuscript is a handmade book. And the art of making books by hand is referred to as manuscript illumination. Now keep in mind, when the slides have a little star on them, that's because these terms that are starred will show up later on a quiz or a test. So just take note. We're going to begin by looking at this example of an illuminated manuscript, and this is from a Book of Hours. And a Book of Hours is a book of prayer that would have been owned by a rich person. Because books were made by hand, they were incredibly expensive. Each sheet was made of leather and painstakingly hand-drawn and hand-lettered with very expensive pigments. A book would have cost about the equivalent of what a brand new car costs today, so it was an incredibly luxury item. However, because a book is also a very personal item, many of the images in illuminated manuscripts are very insightful. So this one here, we have an image of death rising Obviously death was something that was very prominently on the minds of everyone during this time period because of the plague. And one shift that we notice in artwork of this time period is that there is a renewed interest in depicting the lives of common people, everyday people. This here is another image from another book of Hours, illustrated by the Limburg brothers, who shortly after making this disappear, potentially because they died of the plague. And if you look at it, you'll see that the castle and the noble people are far in the background, but what's emphasized is the daily life of the peasants. And this idea of bringing forth maybe people that weren't as recognized by society in artwork is, of course, due, in fact, to the fact that the plague effectively leveled all strata of society. So nobody was immune to the plague, and this brings about a renewed interest in people of all classes. This image here is starred because it's the most famous image from this book of Hours that was illustrated by the Limburg brothers. But I also just want to show you this one here. Because books were very personal objects, the images in them were sometimes free to be humorous or satirical in a way that large-scale art of the time period often wasn't. And in this rather humorous image of February, you can see the peasants are warming themselves by the fire, but of course their genitals are exposed, which was meant to be something of a personal joke, and I find it actually quite hilarious. Moving along, we're going to look at a triptych. I want you to know these two vocabulary words, triptych and diptych. A triptych is an image that's made on 3 panels that are side by side, and a diptych is an image made of 2 panels that are side by side. Triptychs and diptychs were often used as altar pieces because they can be stored in a church, closed, and then opened for important events. Also, because they can be closed, they can be transported easily without damaging the inside image. This here is the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck. On the outside, we can see a portrait of the donors, the people that gave money for this to be made. And I want you to notice how large it is. It's almost 11 feet tall. So this would have been displayed prominently in a church, and it would probably have been closed on most days and then opened, and here it is opened, during important occasions. It's hard to get a sense just from this image how magnificent, monumental, and beautifully painted this is. Notice that it's painted with oil paint. Oil was a relatively new invention during this time period. Most paintings up to this time had been painted with pigment, so pure color, that was suspended in egg white or water, which dries much faster and doesn't have such a brilliant effect. With oil paint, because oil obviously dries very slowly, the artist is free to work and rework an image so that a higher level of detail can be achieved, and oil has a certain luster, a shine to it, that other types of paint don't have. This altarpiece is painted with incredible detail, so here are some details of it so that you can see it more clearly. Look at the glass scepter that God holds, and look at the very, very delicate and rich detail in the background. These images here are actually of a pelican feeding its chicks, because it was believed that pelicans fed their chicks blood, and that was a reference to Christ. And here we can see on the outside, this is from the closed version of the altarpiece, Adam and Eve. I also really love this detail of the angels singing, because based on their faces alone, I don't think that's a song that I would particularly want to listen to, but nobody asked me. and this image here of people coming from all corners of the earth to worship the sacred Lamb of Christ, the sacrificial lamb. Just incredible detail. And moving forward, another piece by Jan van Eyck. This is the Arnolfini painting of Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride. This again is painted with incredible detail because it was done in oil paint. The two people pictured are, beyond question, the donors, the people that gave money for this to be made, because it's a portrait. And the painting itself is rich with symbols. So if you see in the foreground, we have a dog, a symbol of fidelity, leading some people to believe this is a marriage portrait. Also, the wife is holding her hand above her belly, perhaps in reference to a pregnancy. But a lot of it is also very hard to read, and nobody's actually quite sure why this was made. Was it actually a wedding portrait? There's a lot of debate. So if art history is something you're curious to study, these sort of endless debates are something that art historians get quite caught up in. I want to talk about printmaking, and printmaking is a different type of art form altogether. It's a way of printing multiple copies of an image using a printing press, and that piece of machinery you see pictured on the left is a press. There are three main types of printmaking that arose during this time period: woodcut, letterpress, and engraving. Now, I think it's impossible to emphasize how important printmaking was, because before this time period there was no way to create more than one of a thing except by hand. So if you wanted more than one book, you would have to write it out separately every single time. When printing was first invented, people were so shocked by it, and it revolutionized the spread of ideas and imagery so quickly that many people believed that it was evil, and said that people that were using printmaking were using it as an instrument of Satan. It's the equivalent of the internet to us today, the way that it revolutionized thought and the ability for an image or a written idea to reach the masses. The most basic form of printmaking is woodcut, and woodcut was actually used in the East for centuries before it finally reached the Western world. Here's an example of what a woodcut looks like. It's an image that's carved directly into a block of wood in relief, and then ink is applied to it and it's printed. Here's an example of an early woodcut from Germany, and you can see that it's a religious image. Many early prints were religious images, and people believed that they held so much power that they would often, upon purchasing them, consume them, eat them, because they believed that they had power to heal. And then letterpress. Letterpress is a form of printing words, and it's most often done with lead type. So these are letters cast into lead, and they're backwards, and then they can be organized to print anything. This is an example of the Gutenberg Bible, which is one of the earliest printed Bibles. And then there's engraving, which is carving directly onto metal, usually copper, because copper is durable, but it's also soft to carve. So on the left you have an image that was carved into copper, ink was pressed down into the carved lines, and then it was printed onto a sheet of paper. A burin is used to engrave copper, which is like a chisel, but it's filled in so that it's stronger. And then you can see, because the image is down into the plate, more pressure is required to print an engraving. And on the right you have an image of what it looks like to actually print an engraving on a printing press. And we're going to end with this image here. This is an engraving by Martin Schongauer. It's called Saint Anthony Tormented by Demons. This is an incredibly famous early engraving because Schongauer was one of the first artists to truly try to raise printmaking to an art form in its own right, and the detail and level of expressiveness of the demons and the exaggerated texture of the fur was unrivaled by any of his contemporaries. People who saw it would say that it almost brought printmaking to the level of painting. But as we will see in following chapters, there's always tension. Many critics and lay people of the time would argue that printmaking was not an art form in its own right. It was just a sort of like second-rate popular form of media. And that concludes this lecture. Thank you.